And the reason we call today's events Trading Places is because I think all three sectors are starting to think more and wrestle with what does this mean for our sense of place, where we do business or where we run our charity, or if we're a municipal organisation, the area that we are politically responsible for. And I think most of us are here because we have some sense of commitment to our community, whether that's a physical geographical place or whether that's a community of interest, but we have an interest in a particular community that we serve. Now, I'm from Exeter CBS. Devon Live is a pan-Devon conversation and network. It's very important to say that, but forgive me, I'm going to talk a little bit from the perspective of the place that I work in and care about, which is Exeter. Now, Exeter Council for Voluntary Service began life in 1947 as the Exeter Council of Social Service. And it's not accidental that it was immediately after the Second World War, because the things that we take for granted now, like the welfare state and the National Health Service, didn't exist at this point, and the nation had just been through the trauma of World War II. And those of you that are familiar with Exeter's history will know that Exeter was bombed as part of the Bowkett raids by Germany and was left devastated. The city centre was left devastated. Now just have a think about what that means from your sector's perspective, because that would have been damaged businesses, places where people used to work, that used to generate some of Exeter's wealth. If you work in the public sector, a lot of the infrastructures, the civic infrastructures, had broken down during the war, had been damaged. And it was the community sector, my sector if you like, that was being called on to help with the rebuilding. And as we were preparing for this event, I went into our archives and dug out our very first annual report. And our chair at the time wrote that 1948, the next year, was going to be a momentous year in the history of our nation, with the passing of the National Health Service Act and the Welfare State Act. And many are wondering if there will still be a need for voluntary service. Now, the reason we wanted to sort of refer back to that at this event is because obviously 1948 did see the birth of a lot of the structures that Kareem was talking about that did begin to replace the sort of sense of community effort and people pulling together to support one another to a reliance on some state structures. And I would argue that since 2010, what we've started to see is the dismantling of some of that, certainly the rethinking and the restructuring and the rewiring of some of that, and the challenges back with communities, as we saw through Kevin's presentation about this government's ambitions around the big society, that communities will once again mobilise. Now that might be out of altruism, it might be out of necessity, but frankly, if some body, if some organisation doesn't step into the void that's left by retreating public services, we will fail as a society, our communities. Now, just before I go on to talk about what Devon Live is developing into and how it serves this conversation, I want to refer back to something that Kareem mentioned just by way of context. It's a very short 2-minute film, and it's by the local government association, and it is the Rewiring Public Services Animation. And it's really just to give you a little bit of context, because all of us have sectors that are reliant on one another now. Now what I mean by that is, local councils' funding now is linked intrinsically with economic growth. The more growth we generate in a local area, the more of that wealth local authorities can retain and spend on local services through things like the community infrastructure levy, the new homes bonus, and increasingly the ability to retain a percentage of business rates. So if you work in the public sector, it is in your interest that your community is thriving economically and that businesses are growing and developing, because the public sector is reliant on that money. Similarly, the businesses themselves need the public sector to position the place in a way that is attractive to markets. This is something that Exeter has spent money on. In underground stations in London, there are posters telling you to invest in Exeter. A very deliberate strategy to attract wealth down here, and through things like superfast broadband, other infrastructure services that the public sector works to provide, the business sector can thrive on the back of that. And for those of us working in the community and voluntary sector, we have for a long, long time been heavily reliant on grants and investments coming from the public sector. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how we might see one another. But I just want to run the film first, and then we'll come on to talk about how this is changing how the community sector is operating.